When 8-year-old Emma wrapped her arms around the struggling single dad in the grocery store checkout line, her military mother's blood ran cold, because the face staring back at her was the one she'd been searching for across 3 continents for the past 5 years. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your story too. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like distant aircraft, casting everything in the grocery store in that peculiar shade of pale that made even the ripest tomatoes look anemic. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos pushed her cart down the cereal aisle with military precision, her posture straight, movements efficient, eyes constantly scanning habits carved deep by 3 tours overseas that didn't just disappear because she was back on American soil buying Lucky Charms for her daughter. Emma skipped alongside the cart, her small hands trailing along the shelves, occasionally grabbing items that caught her eye before Maria gently redirected her attention. At 8 years old, Emma had learned to navigate the careful dance of having a mother who'd been gone more than she'd been home, who flinched at sudden noises and kept her back to walls whenever possible. But she was resilient in the way children are, finding joy in the simple fact that Mom was here now, present and solid, even if she sometimes felt like she was looking through Maria rather than at her. "Can we get the cookies with the rainbow sprinkles?" Emma asked, holding up a package with the kind of hopeful expression that could melt titanium. Maria glanced at the nutrition label out of habit, then at her daughter's face, and felt something loosen in her chest. "Put them in the cart," she said, and Emma's smile was worth every artificial ingredient listed on the back. They'd been back stateside for 6 weeks now. 6 weeks of trying to remember how to be a mother instead of a soldier, how to sleep without one ear listening for mortars, how to stand in line at the commissary without calculating exit routes. The base housing felt too quiet, too safe, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit anymore. But Emma made it bearable. Emma made everything bearable. The checkout lines stretched longer than usual for a Tuesday afternoon. Maria chose the shortest one, positioning herself where she could see both the entrance and the customer service counter, old instincts dying hard. Emma leaned against the cart, humming something tuneless while studying the magazine covers with the intensity of a reconnaissance mission. That's when they heard Ida Child's crying that cut through the ambient noise like a blade. Not the whining kind of tears that came from wanting candy or being told no, but the raw, desperate sobbing of a little one who was scared and overwhelmed. Maria's head snapped toward the sound, muscles tensing automatically. 3 checkout lanes over, a man stood hunched over the card reader, his shoulders rigid with the particular kind of stress that came from public humiliation. In his arms, a toddler maybe 2 years old, wailed with the kind of abandon that only comes when the world feels too big and nothing makes sense anymore. The man's card had been declined, and the cashier wore the expression of someone who'd seen this drama play out too many times to feel anything but tired annoyance. "I'm sorry, sir," the cashier was saying, her voice carrying that artificial patience retail workers perfected. "The card's been declined. Do you have another form of payment?" The mantle, lean, wearing a faded flannel shirt that had seen better years, shifted the crying child to his other arm and dug through his wallet with the desperation of someone searching for miracles in worn leather. His movements were sharp, frustrated, and Maria could see the way his jaw clenched as he fought to maintain composure while his son's cries grew louder. "Dad, everyone's looking," Emma whispered, tugging at Maria's sleeve. Her voice carried that particular kind of empathy children possessed before the world taught them to look away from other people's pain. Maria glanced down at her daughter, then back at the struggling father. The line behind him was growing restless. A woman in designer workout clothes checked her phone with exaggerated irritation. An elderly man muttered something under his breath about people who couldn't manage their finances. The judgment was thick in the air, pressing down on the man's shoulders like a physical weight. "Mama," Emma said quietly, "he needs help." "It's not our business, baby," Maria replied automatically, but her eyes stayed fixed on the scene. The man had found another card, was sliding it through the reader with hands that trembled just slightly. The toddler's cries had escalated to the point where other shoppers were actively avoiding the lane, steering their carts wide like they were navigating around an accident. The second card declined with a harsh beep that seemed to echo through the store. The man closed his eyes for a moment, and Maria saw something she recognized, the particular kind of defeat that came from fighting a war on too many fronts. His free hand ran through dark hair that needed cutting, and when he opened his eyes, they held the hollow look of someone who'd been running on empty for too long. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside if you can't," the cashier began, but the man was already moving, grabbing what groceries he could afford and abandoning the rest. Baby formula, diapers, a package of ground turkey that was probably going to be their dinner. All left behind on the conveyor belt like casualties of a battle he couldn't win. That's when Emma broke free. Before Maria could react, before she could grab her daughter's hand or call her back, Emma was moving, not running but walking with the kind of determined purpose Maria had seen in soldiers heading into hostile territory. The 8-year-old slipped between shopping carts and around adults who towered over her like trees, her destination clear. "Emma!" Maria called, but her daughter was already there, standing in front of the man who'd stopped just past the checkout line, still holding his crying son, still radiating the kind of shame that came from failing when people were watching. Emma didn't say anything at first. She just looked up at the toddler, whose tears had slowed to hiccuping sobs, and then at the man holding him. Without hesitation, without asking permission, she reached out and wrapped her small arms around both of them, child and father, a hug that was fierce and pure and completely unself-conscious. The man froze. The toddler's crying stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch. The entire checkout area seemed to pause, caught in the unexpected grace of a child's instinctive kindness. Maria moved then, her body finally catching up to her mind, weaving through the other shoppers toward her daughter. But as she got closer, as the man lifted his head and his face came into full view for the first time, her own world ground to a halt. The features were older, more weathered, marked by lines that hadn't been there before. The dark hair was longer, streaked with premature gray. There was a scar along his left temple that disappeared into his hairline damage that told stories she'd never heard. But the eyes, even hollow with exhaustion, even unfocused with embarrassment, were unmistakable. David Chen. Sergeant David Chen, her battle buddy, her friend. The man who'd thrown himself between her and an IED blast in a marketplace in Kandahar 5 years ago and disappeared from her life like smoke. Maria's hand went instinctively to her chest, where her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. The grocery store, the fluorescent lights, the ambient noise of shopping carts and crying children, all of it faded into background static. She was standing in a supermarket in North Carolina, but her mind was halfway around the world, in the dust and heat and terror of a moment that had changed everything. David was alive. David was here. David was holding a crying toddler and couldn't afford groceries, and somehow Emma had found him first. He still hadn't seen her. His attention was focused entirely on the small girl who'd wrapped herself around him like a life preserver, his expression caught between confusion and something that might have been gratitude. The toddler in his arms had quieted completely, distracted by Emma's presence, tiny fingers reaching out to touch her dark hair. "It's okay," Emma was saying in that solemn way children had when they were trying to fix something bigger than they understood. "Sometimes dads just need hugs too." David's throat worked as he swallowed hard, and Maria saw his eyes blink rapidly, the particular kind of blinking that came when someone was fighting not to break down in public. His free hand came up to rest gently on Emma's back, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you," he said quietly. That's really kind of you." Emma pulled back just far enough to look up at him seriously. "My mama says everyone's fighting a hard battle, even if we can't see it. Is your battle really hard right now?" The question hit David like a physical blow. Maria watched his face crumble for just a moment before he rebuilt his composure, but not before she caught a glimpse of the pain he was carrying. It was written in the lines around his eyes, in the way his shoulders curved inward, like he was protecting something fragile in his chest. "Yeah," he admitted to her daughter. "It's pretty hard right now." Emma nodded with the gravity of a general receiving a battlefield report. "Then you need more hugs. Hugs help with hard battles." Maria forced herself to move forward, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. Each step brought her closer to a conversation she'd imagined 1,000 times, but never thought would happen in the produce section of a grocery store. Her mouth was dry, her hands shaking slightly, and she had to consciously control her breathing the way she'd been taught in basic training. "Emma?" she called softly, finally finding her voice. "Come here, baby." David's head turned at the sound of her voice, and she watched recognition hit him like a freight train. His eyes widened, his mouth opened slightly, and the color drained from his face so completely that Maria thought he might collapse right there between the shopping carts. "Maria?" The name came out as barely a whisper, like he was afraid saying it too loud might make her disappear. She stopped 3 feet away from him, close enough to see the scar tissue that marked his left hand, close enough to catch the scent of baby powder, and something else, something that reminded her of long nights in a forward operating base, of shared MREs and whispered conversations about home. Close enough to see that the man who'd saved her life was drowning, and she hadn't been there to throw him a rope. "Hi, David," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. Emma looked between them with the sharp intelligence of a child who'd learned to read adult emotions for survival. "You know each other?" David shifted his son to his other arm, the movement automatic, protective. The toddler Jake, Maria remembered suddenly. David had talked about wanting to name his first son Jake, was studying her with the frank curiosity of the very young. David started, then stopped, his throat working again. "We used to work together." It was the safest answer, the one that didn't require explaining desert camouflage and body armor and the way sand got into everything, including your soul. But Maria heard all the words he didn't say, saw them in the way his free hand trembled slightly, in the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "A long time ago," Maria added, for Emma's benefit, and maybe for her own. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 5 years of unanswered questions and guilt that had calcified into something harder than bone. Around them, the grocery store continued its normal rhythm, children whining, cartwheels squeaking, the distant announcement of a cleanup needed in aisle 7, but in their small circle, time felt suspended. Emma, bless her heart, seemed to sense the weight of the moment without understanding its dimensions. She stepped closer to Maria, but kept one small hand resting on David's arm, bridging the gap between them with the unconscious wisdom of a child who'd spent her life building connections across difficult terrain. "Mama," she said quietly, "he left his groceries up there. The baby needs food." Maria looked past David to the checkout counter, where the abandoned items still sat on the conveyor belt. Baby formula, diapers, the ground turkey that was probably going to stretch into 3 meals, basic necessities that had been sacrificed to a declining bank account, and she knew with the certainty of someone who'd been there that this wasn't the first time David had made that choice. She pulled out her wallet before she could think too hard about it, before pride or protocol or the complicated history between them could stop her. "I'll get those," she said, already moving toward the checkout. "Maria?" "No." David's voice carried the particular edge of a man who'd been accepting charity for too long and couldn't stomach another helping. "You don't need to, it's already done," she said without turning around, and it was. She was already pulling out her credit card, already nodding to the confused cashier, already making the decision that should have been simple but felt like defusing a bomb. When she turned back, David was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Gratitude warred with humiliation across his features, and she saw him fighting the same battle she'd fought in too many foreign markets, the choice between pride and survival. "You don't understand," he said quietly, shifting Jake again. I can't keep taking people's charity." "It's not charity," Maria replied, and she was surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "It's what you do for family." The word hung in the air between them like a flag planted in contested territory. family. It was a word that carried different meanings now than it had 5 years ago, when they'd shared the peculiar intimacy of soldiers who trusted each other with their lives. Now it felt both too small and too large for whatever this was. David's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, they were bright with unshed tears. "Maria, Dada sad?" Jake interrupted, his small voice cutting through the tension with the clarity of a bell. His tiny hand patted David's cheek with the gentle concern of a child who'd learned too young to monitor his father's emotional weather. "No, buddy," David said, his voice thick. "Dada's okay, just surprised to see an old friend." Emma, who'd been watching this exchange with the focused attention of a battlefield medic, stepped forward again. "Mr. David, are you going to be okay? Like, really okay?" The question was so direct, so innocent in its demand for honesty, that David actually laughed a sound that was half humor, half sob. "I don't know, sweetheart, but your hug helped a lot." Maria felt something crack open in her chest, some carefully constructed wall that had been holding back 5 years of guilt and worry and sleepless nights wondering if he was alive, if he was safe, if the injuries from that day had healed properly. The answer was standing in front of her. Alive, yes, but not safe. Not healed, carrying wounds that ran deeper than the scar on his temple. The cashier cleared her throat politely, holding out the receipt and the bags Maria had paid for. The moment of suspension was ending, reality reasserting itself in the form of other customers waiting, children growing restless, the simple logistics of existing in the world. "Here," Maria said, taking the bags and offering them to David. "For Jake." He accepted them slowly, like he was handling something that might explode. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than they should have. "I mean it. Thank you." Maria nodded, not trusting her voice, and turned to Emma. "Come on, baby. We should let Mr. David get home." But Emma, with the stubborn persistence of a child who decided someone needed protecting, planted her feet. "Can we see him again?" she asked, looking between them. "He seems lonely. And Jake doesn't have anyone to play with." The observation was so accurate, so perfectly aimed at the heart of things, that Maria felt her carefully maintained composure wobble. David was lonely. It was written in every line of his body, in the way he held his son, like he was the only anchor in a storm-tossed world. "Emma, we can't just," Maria started, but David interrupted. "Actually," he said, his voice careful, tentative, "if you wanted to. I mean, Jake doesn't get to be around other kids much. And you've already done more than." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Sorry, I shouldn't ask." "You're not asking," Emma said firmly. "I am. Right, Mama? We could have a play date. Jake needs friends, and I need friends, and grown-ups need friends too." Out of the mouths of babes. Maria looked at David, really looked at him, and saw the man who'd once shared his last pack of beef jerky with her when supply lines got cut off. The man who'd listened to her talk about Emma for hours during long watches, who'd carried pictures of his future family in his breast pocket like talismans. The man who'd pushed her out of the way of an explosion and disappeared from her life before she could thank him, before she could tell him that she was sorry, that she should have been faster, should have seen the threat first. "Okay," she heard herself say. "A playdate sounds nice." David's smile was small but genuine, the first real emotion she'd seen from him that wasn't painted with exhaustion or shame. "Yeah," he said. "That sounds really nice." Emma cheered quietly, already making plans in the way children did, and Jake clapped his hands in unconscious mimicry of her enthusiasm. Around them, the grocery store hummed with ordinary life, but Maria felt like she was standing at the edge of something enormous, a chance to fix what had been broken, to build a bridge across 5 years of silence and guilt, or maybe just a chance to prove that some bonds, forged in fire and tested by distance, were stronger than time itself. As they walked toward the exit together, Emma chattering excitedly about parks and playgrounds, Jake babbling responses that only made sense to him, Maria caught David's eye over their children's heads. The look that passed between them was heavy with history and possibility, with all the words they hadn't said and all the healing that still needed to happen. But it was a beginning. After 5 years of wondering, of searching, of carrying guilt like a stone in her chest. It was finally a beginning. The dreams always started the same way, with dust. Fine, powdery dust that got into everything, coating her skin like a second layer, settling in the creases of her uniform, turning her sweat into gritty paste that never fully washed away. The kind of dust that existed only in places where the earth had been baked by sun and violence until it forgot how to hold together. Maria would wake from these dreams with the taste of Afghanistan still in her mouth, her sheets soaked with sweat that smelled like fear and diesel fuel. It had been 5 years since her last deployment, but her body hadn't gotten the memo. Some nights, she'd reach for her sidearm before remembering she was in North Carolina, in base housing, safe behind walls that didn't shake from mortar fire. But tonight, as she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, the dreams felt different, more immediate, more real. Because David was alive, and that changed everything about the story she'd been telling herself for half a decade. Emma had finally gone to sleep after an hour of excited chatter about their new friends, about Jake's curly hair and how David had sad eyes, but a nice smile. She'd drawn a picture before bedstick figures holding hands under a crayon soon and taped it to the refrigerator next to her other masterpieces. For when Mr. David and Jake come over, she'd explained, with the confidence of a child who believed all good things were possible if you just drew them clearly enough. Maria stared at that drawing now, at the simple faith it represented, and felt the weight of 5 years pressing down on her shoulders like a full pack in desert heat. Because seeing David again hadn't just been a shock, it had been a reckoning. All those nights she'd lain awake wondering if he was alive, if he was okay, if the injuries from that day had healed properly. All those calls to VA hospitals, all those searches through military databases, all those dead ends that led nowhere but back to her own guilt. She pulled out her laptop and opened the folder she'd never been able to delete. David Chen, search files. Dozens of documents, phone numbers, email chains with military contacts who'd promised to help but never had anything concrete to offer. Medical discharge paperwork that led to forwarding addresses that led to disconnected phone numbers. A digital paper trail that ended abruptly 18 months after that day in Kandahar, like David had simply vanished from the face of the earth. But he hadn't vanished. He'd been right here, 3 towns over, struggling to buy groceries for his son while she'd been combing through databases looking for ghosts. The irony was so sharp it cut. Maria closed the laptop and let her mind drift back, the way she'd trained herself not to do for so long. Back to Forward Operating Base Chapman, where the air always tasted like burning plastic and hope. Back to when David Chen was Sergeant Chen, and they were partners in the peculiar dance of soldiers who'd learned to trust each other completely because the alternative was death. They'd been assigned together almost by accident, 2 specialists with complementary skills thrown into the same unit during a personnel shuffle that made sense only to some colonel behind a desk in Kabul. David was communications, Maria was intelligence analysis. He could make radios work in sandstorms, she could read terrain and people with equal precision. On paper, they were just another pair of soldiers doing their jobs. In reality, they became something rarer. Friends who understood that friendship in a war zone meant something different than it did back home. David had been the one to teach her how to sleep through mortar attacks, how to tune out the sound of incoming fire that wasn't aimed at you. The ones that'll kill you, you won't hear coming, he'd said with the dark humor that kept them all sane. So there's no point losing sleep over the ones you can hear. He'd been the one who listened when she got the call that Emma's father, her ex-husband, had filed for full custody while she was deployed. David had sat with her in the communications tent while she cried angry tears, had helped her draft emails to lawyers she couldn't afford, had reminded her that being a good soldier and being a good mother weren't mutually exclusive, even when the world seemed determined to make her choose. She'd been the one who held his hand when he got the news that his wife Sarah was pregnant. They'd been trying for years, and the timing was terribly. 8 months left on deployment, a baby due while he was on the other side of the world, but David had grinned like he'd won the lottery. A boy, he'd said, showing her the grainy ultrasound photo. We're going to name him Jake, after my grandfather. They'd been the ones who kept each other human in a place that specialized in stripping humanity away layer by layer. The mission that changed everything had started like any other routine patrol, through Kandahar's market district, gathering intelligence on insurgent movement patterns, trying to win hearts and minds one carefully modulated conversation at a time. David had been on comms, Maria on analysis, working with a small team of Afghan National Army soldiers who knew the terrain better than any satellite image ever could. The marketplace had been busy that morning, full of vendors hawking everything from fresh bread to bootleg DVDs. Children had followed their patrol with the mixture of curiosity and wariness that came from growing up in a war zone. Normal sounds, normal sights, the kind of routine that could lull you into thinking you were safe. Maria should have seen it. That was her job, to read the environment, to spot the things that didn't belong, to identify threats before they became casualties. She should have noticed the vendor who kept checking his watch, the way the crowd seemed to thin out in one particular section, the subtle signs that locals used to signal danger to each other. But she'd been distracted. Emma's custody hearing was scheduled for the following week, and her ex-husband's lawyer had been sending increasingly aggressive emails about her abandonment of their daughter. Maria's mind had been split between two continents, two battles, and in that moment of divided attention, she'd missed the most important thing. David had seen it first. The man with the heavy coat on a 90-degree day, walking too purposefully through the crowd, hand pressed against his chest like he was holding something precious. David had started to raise his rifle, started to call out a warning, but the man was already too close to a group of children buying candy from a street vendor. The first explosion had been the one Maria saw coming. The moment her training finally overcame her distraction, she'd started to move, started to shout, but David was already there. He'd grabbed her by the shoulders and thrown her backwards, his body covering hers as the shockwave rolled over them like the fist of an angry god. She'd hit the ground hard, her helmet cracking against concrete, vision going white with impact. For a moment, the world had been perfectly silent, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so loud it couldn't be processed as noise. Then her hearing had returned all at once, screaming. The rattle of automatic weapons, David's voice shouting into his radio for immediate medevac. The secondary blast had come 30 seconds later, just as they were starting to move. An IED buried in the rubble of a building that had been bombed weeks earlier, triggered by some insurgent watching from a rooftop half a mile away. Maria had been getting to her feet when the world exploded again, and this time, David had been standing directly over the device. She remembered fragments after that. David's body thrown through the air like a rag doll, blood that looked too bright against the dust and concrete, the weight of debris pinning her legs while she screamed his name. The medics, who'd arrived too late to prevent the damage but just in time to keep death at bay, they'd loaded her onto the first helicopter, conscious, responsive, vital signs stable, despite a concussion and 2 broken ribs. David had gone on the second bird, unconscious, bleeding from injuries that would require surgeries she couldn't even pronounce. She'd tried to fight the medics, tried to go with him, but they'd strapped her down and filled her with enough morphine to quiet her protests. "He's going to be fine," the flight medic had shouted over the rotor wash. "Your boy's tough, he'll be fine." But when Maria had woken up in the field hospital 18 hours later, David was gone. Evacuated to Germany, then to Walter Reed, then to somewhere the doctors couldn't or wouldn't tell her. Patient confidentiality, they'd said. Chain of command issues. He was alive. He was receiving the best possible care, and that was all the information they were authorized to share. Maria had called in every favor she had used connections she'd built over 6 years of military service, had even gotten her commanding officer to make official inquiries. The trail had led to medical discharge paperwork and a forwarding address in Virginia that turned out to be a P.O. box that had been abandoned 6 months after it was opened. David Chen had disappeared into the vast bureaucracy of veteran care, another casualty who'd slipped through cracks that seemed designed to swallow people whole. For 2 years, Maria had searched. She'd called VA hospitals from coast to coast, had attended veteran support group meetings where she didn't belong, had even hired a private investigator who'd taken her money, and delivered nothing but false hope. Every lead had ended the same way, with forms that couldn't be released and privacy laws that protected David's right to disappear. Eventually, she'd forced herself to stop. Emma needed a mother who was present, not one who was chasing ghosts across a country that had already forgotten about a war that was still eating people alive. Maria had buried her guilt under new deployments, new missions, new ways to prove that she deserved to come home when David hadn't been able to. But the guilt never really went away. It lived in her chest like shrapnel, working its way closer to vital organs with each passing day. She'd throw herself into dangerous assignments, volunteer for patrols that other soldiers avoided, push herself harder and further than anyone expected. Not because she was brave, but because she was trying to balance some cosmic ledger that existed only in her own mind. Every promotion had felt like theft. Every commendation had been a reminder that she was still here to receive it. Every time someone called her a hero, she thought about David's body flying through the air, about the split second when he'd chosen to save her instead of himself. Survivor's guilt was a clinical term for something that felt like drowning on dry land. And now, sitting in her kitchen at 3 a.m, Maria finally understood why all her searches had failed. David hadn't disappeared into the system. He'd been living a life too ordinary for official records to track. Working at an auto shop, raising his son alone, struggling to afford groceries like millions of other Americans who didn't appear in military databases or VA registries. He'd become exactly what every soldier hoped to become after service: invisible, normal, forgotten by a country that preferred its veterans neatly categorized as either heroes or tragedies, with no room for the vast gray area in between. The coffee had gone cold, but Maria drank it anyway, the bitter taste grounding her in the present moment. Tomorrow, she would see David again. Emma was already planning activities, drawing up lists of games she wanted to teach Jake, convinced that friendship was as simple as showing up with good intentions and an open heart. If only it were that easy for adults. Maria's phone buzzed with a text message, and for a moment, her heart jumped with the irrational hope that it might be David. But it was just a notification from the base, a reminder about some mandatory training session that would teach her how to reintegrate into civilian life, as if there were a manual for becoming human again after learning how to be a weapon. She closed the laptop and walked to Emma's room, standing in the doorway to watch her daughter sleep. Emma's face was peaceful, relaxed, unmarked by the kind of dreams that left you sweating and reaching for weapons that weren't there. She slept like a child who believed the world was fundamentally safe, that the adults in her life were capable of protecting her from all the things that lived in darkness. Maria envied that faith, even as she'd kill to preserve it. Tomorrow would bring new complications, questions about why she'd never mentioned David before, about what kind of work they'd done together, about the scars she'd glimpsed on his hands, and the way his eyes had gone flat when he'd talked about not being able to afford groceries. Emma was too smart, and she'd start connecting dots that Maria wasn't ready to explain. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, Maria knew where David was. He was alive, he was struggling, he needed help, and she was finally in a position to offer it. Not as a fellow soldier, not as someone trying to balance cosmic ledgers, but as a friend who'd found her way back to someone she'd thought was lost forever. It wasn't redemption that would require David's forgiveness, and she wasn't sure she deserved it. But it was a chance. A chance to prove that some bonds forged in fire were strong enough to survive time and distance, and the particular kind of damage that came from living through things that shouldn't be survived. A chance to finally answer the question that had been eating at her for 5 years. What did you owe someone who'd saved your life at the cost of their own? Tomorrow, she might finally find out. The morning came too soon, arriving with the kind of gray light that made everything look washed out and uncertain. Maria had managed maybe 2 hours of actual sleep, the rest of the night spent staring at the ceiling and rehearsing conversations that would probably never happen the way she imagined them. Emma bounced into the kitchen, already dressed and chattering about their plans to see David and Jake again, her enthusiasm undimmed by her mother's obvious exhaustion. She'd even drawn another picture, this one showing 4 stick figures sitting around what might have been a picnic table, all of them smiling under a sun with exaggerated rays. "Can we bring them cookies?" Emma asked, already rummaging through the pantry like she was planning a military operation. "Jake probably likes cookies. All kids like cookies." Maria poured coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, her mind still caught between past and present, between the David she'd known in Afghanistan and the man she'd encountered in the grocery store. They were the same person, but also completely different, like looking at a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. The colors faded, but the image still recognizable. "We should probably call first," Maria said, though she realized she didn't have David's number. They'd exchanged information at the store, but in the shock of recognition, the practical details had gotten lost in the emotional undertow. Emma waved this away with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a social situation that couldn't be solved with direct action. "We'll just go to the store and find him. He has to buy food sometime." It was logical, in the way that 8-year-old logic often was completely impractical, but somehow irrefutable. Maria found herself nodding, already reaching for her keys, because she didn't have a better plan, and because sitting in the house waiting for courage to arrive felt like a kind of cowardice she couldn't afford. The grocery store looked different in daylight, less like a battlefield and more like what it actually was, a place where ordinary people came to buy ordinary things. Maria parked in the same general area where they'd encountered David the day before, though she knew the chances of lightning striking twice were approximately 0, but Emma had a plan. She marched straight to the customer service counter with the determination of a general briefing her troops, leaving Maria to follow in her wake like a slightly embarrassed aide-de-camp. "Excuse me," Emma said to the teenager behind the counter. "Do you know Mr. David? He was here yesterday with his little boy Jake, and he's our friend, and we want to see him again." The teenager, barely older than Emma, really looked confused and slightly overwhelmed by this direct assault of information. What?" Maria stepped in before Emma could launch into a more detailed explanation. "We're looking for someone we met here yesterday. Tall man, dark hair, had a toddler with him. We wanted to return something he dropped." It was a lie, but a harmless one, and it gave the interaction a framework the teenager could understand. Official business, not the messy complexity of adults trying to reconnect across years of silence and guilt. "Oh," the teenager said, looking relieved to have a script to follow. "You could ask at the pharmacy. Mrs. Chen works there, and she knows like everyone." Maria's heart stopped. Mrs. Chen, David's wife, Sarah, the woman who'd been pregnant when Maria last saw David, who'd given birth to Jake while David was recovering from injuries that should have been Maria's. The woman who'd built a life with the man Maria had been unable to stop searching for. Of course, David was married. Of course, he'd rebuilt his life, found stability, created the family he'd dreamed about during those long nights at the FOB. Maria had been living in the past, but David had been living in the present, and the present included a wife who worked at the pharmacy and probably wondered why her husband had come home yesterday talking about an old friend from the army. Emma was already heading toward the pharmacy, apparently oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in her mother's understanding of the situation. Maria followed, her legs feeling like they belonged to someone else, her mind racing through implications and complications that she hadn't considered in her midnight planning session. The pharmacy was busy people picking up prescriptions, asking questions about insurance coverage, the mundane business of maintaining health in a country that made it more complicated than it needed to be. Behind the counter, a woman with shoulder-length brown hair was explaining something about generic substitutions to an elderly man who was nodding but clearly not understanding a word. She was pretty in an understated way, with kind eyes and the sort of patient demeanor that probably made her excellent at her job. She wore scrubs printed with cartoon characters, and when she smiled at the elderly man, it was genuine not the professional courtesy Maria had learned to recognize in people who dealt with the public all day. This was Sarah, David's wife, Jake's mother, the woman who'd held David's family together while he was overseas, who'd probably held him together when he came home broken. Maria felt like an intruder, like someone who'd walked uninvited into a life that had nothing to do with her anymore. But Emma was already at the counter, waiting politely for the woman to finish with her current customer, and there was no graceful way to retreat without causing the kind of scene that would require explanations Maria wasn't prepared to give. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked when the elderly man shuffled away with his medications and a confused expression. "We're looking for Mr. David," Emma announced with her characteristic directness. "He's our friend, and we met him yesterday, and he seemed sad, so we want to make sure he's okay." Sarah's expression shifted, becoming more alert, more focused. "David's my husband," she said slowly, studying Emma with the kind of attention that mothers gave to unexpected situations involving their families. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma Santos," Emma replied without hesitation. "And this is my mama, Maria. She used to work with Mr. David before I was born." The words hung in the air between them, and Maria watched Sarah's face change as she processed the information. Recognition flickered in her eyes, not recognition of Maria herself, but recognition of the name, of the stories David had probably told her about his time overseas. "You're Maria," Sarah said quietly, and it wasn't a question. Maria nodded, not trusting her voice, and Sarah's expression softened into something that might have been sympathy or might have been something more complicated. She glanced around the pharmacy, checking to make sure no one was waiting for assistance, then looked back at Maria with eyes that held questions she was too polite to ask. "David mentioned you?" Sarah said carefully. He said you were important to him. Over there." The words carried weight, the particular gravity that came when people talked around the edges of trauma without naming it directly. Sarah knew. Maybe not the details, maybe not the specific moment when David had thrown himself between Maria and an explosion, but she knew enough. She knew that her husband carried scars that went deeper than the ones visible on his skin, and she knew that Maria's name was connected to those wounds in ways that couldn't be explained in polite conversation. "Is he okay?" Maria asked, finally finding her voice. "Yesterday, at the store, he seemed struggling." Sarah finished for her, and there was no judgment in it, just the exhausted honesty of someone who'd been watching someone she loved slowly drown and hadn't known how to throw him a rope. Emma, apparently sensing that the conversation had moved into territory that adults preferred to navigate without 8-year-old commentary, had wandered over to examine a display of reading glasses with the absorbed attention of a scholar. "He's been having a hard time," Sarah continued, lowering her voice. "Since he got out, things have been difficult. The VA, the disability payments, finding work that doesn't trigger his PTSD. And Jake's been sick, ear infections, and the insurance doesn't cover half of what we need, and David blames himself for everything." Maria felt something crack open in her chest, some carefully maintained barrier between past and present. This wasn't just about David anymore. It was about a family trying to survive in a system that seemed designed to break people who'd already given more than they had to give. "I paid for his groceries yesterday," Maria said quietly. "I hope that was okay. I couldn't watch him walk away without the things Jake needed." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She was clearly fighting not to shed in the middle of her workplace. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how much that meant to him. To us. Can we help?" The question came out before Maria could stop it, driven by something deeper than obligation or guilt. "I mean, is there anything we can do?" Sarah glanced around again, then leaned forward slightly. "He's working at Murphy's auto shop, about 10 minutes from here. He's good at what he does, but they can only give him part-time hours, and it's not enough. He won't take charity. You probably figured that out yesterday, but if you really are his friend—" "I am," Maria said, and meant it. "Then maybe just being his friend is enough," Sarah replied. "He doesn't have many people who understand what he's been through, what you both went through. Maybe that's what he needs more than anything else." Emma had finished her examination of the reading glasses and was now studying a rack of greeting cards with the same intense focus. Sarah followed Maria's gaze and smiled, despite the tears she was still fighting. "She's beautiful," Sarah said. "David told me about her last night, about how she just hugged him and Jake like it was the most natural thing in the world. She's got good instincts about people," Maria said, watching her daughter with the mixture of pride and terror that came with loving someone so completely open to the world's possibilities and dangers. "So did David," Sarah said quietly. "He always said you were the best soldier he ever served with. Said you saved his life more times than he could count." The irony was so sharp it drew blood. Maria wanted to laugh or scream or both, wanted to explain that David had it backwards, that she was the one who owed everything to him. But Sarah was looking at her with such genuine gratitude, such relief at having found someone who might understand her husband's pain, that Maria couldn't bring herself to shatter that hope with the truth. Instead, she pulled out her phone and offered it to Sarah. "Could you give me David's number? Emma would love to set up that playdate, and I'd like to. I'd like to talk to him when he's ready." Sarah took the phone and entered the information with hands that trembled slightly. "He gets off work at 4 today," she said, handing it back, "if you wanted to stop by the shop." Maria nodded, sliding the phone back into her pocket like she was holstering a weapon. "Thank you for telling me where to find him, for trusting me with this." "He needs friends," Sarah said simply. "Good friends who understand what he's carrying. I love him more than anything. But there are parts of his experience that I can't reach, places where he goes that I can't follow." It was an admission that cost her something. Maria could see it in the way Sarah's shoulders tightened, in the slight tremor in her voice. But it was also an offer, not just permission to reconnect with David, but a request for help that was too important for pride to interfere with. Emma had selected a greeting card and was bringing it over for approval, something with a cartoon bear and a message about friendship that was probably perfect, in ways Maria couldn't have planned. "For Mr. David and Jake," Emma announced. "So they know we're thinking about them." Sarah looked at the card, then at Emma, then at Maria, and finally smiled with something that looked like hope. "They'll love it," she said. "They'll love knowing they have friends who care." As they walked back to the car, Emma chattering about the card and making plans for their visit to the auto shop, Maria felt the weight of 5 years shifting on her shoulders. Not disappearing, that guilt would probably never fully leave, but redistributing itself into something that might eventually become manageable. David was alive, he was struggling, he needed help, and for the first time since that day in Kandahar, Maria was in a position to give it. The auto shop sat on the corner of Industrial Boulevard like a relic from a different era, when things were built to last, and fixing something was always cheaper than replacing it. Murphy's Auto Repair had the weathered look of a business that survived on reputation rather than advertising, with oil stains on the concrete that told stories of decades' worth of broken-down cars and the stubborn men who refused to let them die. Maria sat in her car across the street for 20 minutes before she found the courage to turn off the engine. Emma was at school, safely occupied with multiplication tables and playground politics, which meant this conversation, whatever it turned out to be, could happen without 8-year-old commentary or the buffer of childhood innocence to soften the sharp edges of 5 years' worth of unfinished business. Through the open bay doors, she could see figures moving in the shadowy interior, mechanics bent over engines with the focused attention of surgeons. The familiar sounds drifted across the street, the pneumatic hiss of air tools, the clang of metal on metal, the low rumble of engines being coaxed back to life. It was a soundtrack she recognized from her father's garage back in Texas, from the summer jobs that had taught her how machines worked, and how satisfaction could be found in fixing things that were broken. She finally spotted David near the back of the shop, his head and shoulders visible beneath the raised hood of an old Chevy. Even from this distance, even bent over an engine with grease-stained coveralls hiding his frame, she recognized the particular way he held himself, careful, economical in his movements, like someone who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. Maria checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, then immediately felt foolish for caring how she looked. This wasn't a reunion between former lovers or old friends catching up over coffee. This was something more complicated, something that existed in the space between gratitude and guilt, between what had been and what might still be possible. She crossed the street with the measured pace of someone approaching a minefield, her military training at war with her civilian anxiety. The smell hit her first motor oil and metal shavings, WD-40, and the particular scent of honest work being done by people who understood that some things were worth saving. It was a good smell, a clean smell, despite the grease and grime. The shop was busy but not chaotic. 3 bays, each occupied by a vehicle in various stages of mechanical distress. An older man with arms like tree trunks was explaining something to a customer near the front desk, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone who'd spent 40 years translating between automotive problems and human worry. David was exactly where she'd spotted him from across the street, but now she could see the details that distance had obscured. The way his shoulders curved slightly inward, like he was protecting something fragile in his chest. The careful precision of his movements as he worked, each action deliberate and economical. The small tremor in his left hand that he probably thought no one noticed. "Can I help you?" The voice came from behind her, and Maria turned to see a woman in coveralls wiping her hands on a rag. She was maybe 50, with silver threading through brown hair and the kind of direct gaze that said she'd been working in a man's world long enough to spot trouble before it announced itself. "I'm looking for David Chen," Maria said, suddenly aware that she had no good explanation for why a stranger would walk into an auto shop asking for a specific mechanic by name. The woman's expression shifted slightly, becoming more protective. "David's working. Is this about a car?" Before Maria could answer, David's head appeared from under the hood of the Chevy. He was saying something to the mechanic working beside him, but his voice trailed off when he saw her. The wrench in his hand stopped moving. His face went through a series of expressions: surprise, confusion, something that might have been hope, then a careful blankness that Maria recognized as the look of someone who'd learned not to expect good things to last. "Maria?" He said her name like he was testing whether it was real, whether she might disappear if he spoke too loudly. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him set down his tools with the same careful precision he'd been using on the engine. He said something to his coworker, pulled a rag from his pocket to wipe his hands, and walked toward her with the slightly stiff gait of someone whose body carried reminders of old injuries. The woman in coveralls looked between them with the sharp attention of someone trying to decide whether she needed to intervene. "Everything okay here, David?" "Yeah, Murphy," David said without taking his eyes off Maria. This is an old friend." "From the service." Murphy's expression softened slightly, but she didn't move away. "You need to take a break?" David nodded. "If that's okay, 10 minutes?" "Take what you need," Murphy said, then looked at Maria with the kind of direct assessment that came from someone who'd seen her share of broken people walk through these doors. "Coffee's fresh if you want some." Maria followed David through the shop to a small break room that smelled like instant coffee and industrial-strength cleaning supplies. The space was cramped but clean, with a round table that had seen better decades, and a refrigerator covered in safety notices and pictures of coworkers' kids. David poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted any. His movements automatic, like hospitality, was a reflex he couldn't quite shake, even when his world was tilting off its axis. "I can't believe you're here," he said finally, handing her a cup that was warm but not hot, weak but not undrinkable. "I mean, yesterday at the store was. And now you're here." Maria wrapped her hands around the cup, grateful for something to hold. "I got your number from Sarah. She told me where you worked." David's face changed at the mention of his wife's name, something flickering behind his eyes that was too quick for Maria to interpret. "You met Sarah?" "Emma wanted to find you again," Maria said, which was true enough. "She's been drawing pictures all morning, planning activities for Jake. So we went back to the store, and the kid at customer service told us to ask at the pharmacy." "And Sarah just told you where I was?" There was something in his voice that Maria couldn't identify. Not quite suspicion, not quite hurt, but something in that family of emotions. Like he was surprised that information about his whereabouts had been shared without his permission, or maybe surprised that anyone cared enough to ask. She seemed happy that you had friends, Maria said carefully. She said you'd been having a hard time lately. David sat down heavily in one of the plastic chairs, suddenly looking older than his 32 years. The fluorescent lights were harsh, highlighting the lines around his eyes and the premature gray in his hair. The scar on his temple was more visible here, a jagged line that disappeared into his hairline like a road leading to somewhere she couldn't follow. Hard time, he repeated, and there was bitter humor in it. I guess that's one way to put it. Maria sat across from him, the small table feeling like a conference table where negotiations were about to begin. David, what happened? After Germany, after Walter Reed. I tried to find you. I called hospitals. I used military contacts. I even hired a private investigator. It was like you just vanished. He looked up at her, and for a moment, she saw the David. She remembered the one who'd shared MREs and stupid jokes and stories about the family he was going to build when he got home. But then the expression shuddered, becoming careful again. I didn't want to be found, he said quietly. Not by the military, not by the VA, not by... He gestured vaguely in her direction. Not by anyone who would remind me of what happened over there. The words hit harder than Maria had expected. She'd spent 5 years assuming that David's disappearance was bureaucratic incompetence, system failure, the kind of administrative oversight that left veterans lost in paperwork purgatory. She'd never considered that it might have been intentional, that David might have been actively avoiding the very people who were trying to help him. I was trying to help, she said, and heard how inadequate it sounded. I know. David's voice was gentler now, but still distant. But I wasn't ready for help. I wasn't ready for anything except trying to figure out how to live in a body that didn't work the way it used to, in a world that felt like it was made of glass. Maria wanted to ask about his injuries, about the surgeries she'd never been told about the months of recovery that she'd imagined but never witnessed. But something in his posture warned her away from those questions. Some wounds were too fresh to examine, even 5 years later. Sarah said you lost your wife, she said instead, and immediately regretted the directness of it. David's hands tightened around his coffee cup. Cancer, breast cancer. Diagnosed when Jake was 6 months old, gone before his 2nd birthday. His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a medical report. Aggressive type. By the time they caught it, there wasn't much they could do except try to buy time. David, I'm so sorry, he nodded without looking at her. She fought hard, harder than she should have had to, with a new baby and a husband who couldn't be what she needed him to be. I was still pretty messed up from the blast, still dealing with the PTSD, the chronic pain, the nightmares. She was battling cancer and taking care of Jake, and basically taking care of me too. The guilt in his voice was so thick Maria could almost see it, like smoke rising from something that had been burning for too long. She recognized it because she carried the same weight, the same conviction that suffering was somehow their fault, that they should have been stronger, faster, better at protecting the people they loved. That's not your fault, she said, but David shook his head. Isn't it? I came home broken, Maria. Physically, mentally, emotionally broken. Sarah deserved a husband who could support her through the worst thing that ever happened to her, and instead she got someone who needed support himself, someone who would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, who couldn't handle crowds or loud noises, who couldn't even go to her chemo appointments because hospitals triggered panic attacks. Maria felt like she was looking into a mirror that reflected the worst possible version of her own fears. This was what happened when soldiers came home and couldn't find their way back to themselves. This was the price of surviving when survival felt like theft. What about now? She asked. How are you managing with Jake? David's expression softened at the mention of his son. Jake's the only reason I'm still here, he said simply. Some days, he's the only reason I get out of bed. He deserves better than what I can give him, but I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying. You're doing more than trying, Maria said. Yesterday at the store, the way he looked at you, The way he trusted you completely, that doesn't happen with fathers who aren't doing their job." "Their job shouldn't be this hard," David replied. "Buying groceries shouldn't be a strategic operation. Making sure your kid has enough to eat shouldn't require choosing between formula and rent money." Maria leaned forward, closing some of the distance between them. "Is that why you were at the store? Choosing between necessities?" David's jaw tightened, and she saw the pride and shame warring in his expression. "Jake had an ear infection last month. The antibiotics weren't covered by insurance, and the urgent care visit cost $300 I didn't have. So yeah, sometimes I have to choose. Sometimes Jake gets what he needs, and I eat ramen for a week." The image hit Maria like a physical blow. David, the man who'd once shared his last pack of beef jerky with her, going hungry so his toddler could have medicine. It was noble and heartbreaking and completely unnecessary, and the fact that it was happening 3 towns away from her comfortable base housing felt like a personal failure. "Why didn't you apply for VA benefits?" she asked. "Disability, health care, education benefits, you earned all of that." David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I tried. God knows I tried. You know what the VA told me? That my PTSD wasn't service-connected because I didn't have a documented combat action on the day I was injured. Never mind that I was injured by an IED while on patrol in a combat zone. Never mind that I have shrapnel scars and traumatic brain injury symptoms. The paperwork said I was injured in an accident, not in combat, so the disability rating they gave me was barely enough to cover copays." Maria felt anger rising in her chest, hot and clean and familiar. The same anger that had driven her through basic training, through 3 deployments, through every moment when the system had failed people who deserved better, but this time the anger was personal. This time, it was about David. "That's bullshit," she said, and David looked surprised at the vehemence in her voice. "It's the system," he said with the resignation of someone who'd learned not to fight battles he couldn't win. "It's a broken system that needs people to fight it." Maria shot back. "You have witnesses to what happened that day. You have medical records. You have documentation of your injuries and your service record." "I have a dead wife and a toddler to take care of," David said quietly. "I don't have the energy to fight the United States government." The words hung between them like a challenge and a surrender all at once. Maria saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the particular weariness that came from being ground down by bureaucracy and grief, and the simple, overwhelming demands of single parenthood. But she also saw something else, flicker of the David she'd known, the one who'd never backed down from a fight when something important was at stake. "What if you didn't have to fight alone?" she asked. David looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I know the system. I know how to navigate VA paperwork, how to appeal decisions, how to find the people who can actually help, instead of just shuffling you between departments. I know other veterans who've been through this, lawyers who specialize in disability claims. Maria, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering." She leaned forward, her voice gaining intensity. "You saved my life, David. You threw yourself between me and an explosion, and you've been paying the price for that decision ever since. The least I can do is help you get what you've earned." David was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee like it might contain answers to questions he'd stopped asking years ago. When he looked up, his eyes held a complexity of emotions that Maria couldn't untangle: gratitude and fear, and something that might have been hope, all wrapped together in the careful expression of someone who'd learned not to expect rescue. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why do you want to help me?" The question was so direct, so vulnerable, that Maria felt her own careful defenses crack. She could give him the easy answer because they were friends, because it was the right thing to do, because everyone deserved help when they needed it. But sitting here in this break room that smelled like instant coffee and honest work, looking at the man who'd changed the trajectory of her entire life with one split-second decision, she owed him something closer to the truth. "Because I've been carrying you with me for 5 years," she said quietly. "Because every good thing that's happened to me since that day in Kandahar has felt like something I didn't deserve. Because I've thrown myself into every dangerous assignment, every impossible mission, trying to balance some cosmic ledger that probably only exists in my head. David's expression shifted, becoming more alert. "Maria, because I came home and you didn't," she continued, the words spilling out like water through a broken dam. "Because I got promoted and commended and called a hero while you were fighting insurance companies and learning how to live with chronic pain and raising a son alone because your wife died while you were too broken to take care of her the way she deserved." "Stop!" David's voice was sharp, cutting through her spiral of guilt like a blade. "Just stop! What happened to Sarah wasn't your fault." "But what happened to you was—" "No, it wasn't." He leaned forward, his voice intense, almost angry. "What happened to me was an IED planted by insurgents who wanted to kill Americans. What happened to me was my choice to push you out of the way because I saw the threat first and I reacted the way we were trained to react. What happened to me was war, Maria, not you." Maria felt tears burning behind her eyes, 5 years' worth of guilt and grief and sleepless nights condensed into this moment of reckoning. "But I should have seen it first. That was my job: intelligence analysis, threat assessment. I was supposed to keep us safe, and I was supposed to watch your back," David replied. "We were supposed to take care of each other, and that's exactly what we did. I don't regret what I did that day, Maria. I've regretted a lot of things since then, but saving your life isn't one of them." The words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. Because in all her midnight recriminations and guilt-fueled career decisions, she'd never considered that David might not blame her for what happened. That the weight she'd been carrying might be hers alone. "You don't understand," she said, wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "I searched for you for 2 years. 2 years of calling hospitals and chasing dead ends and hiring investigators who took my money and delivered nothing. And all that time, you were here, struggling, and I was living in comfortable base housing, feeling sorry for myself." David reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. His fingers were rough from work, warm despite the chill of the break room, and solid in a way that made her realize how much she'd missed having someone in her life who understood the weight she carried. "I wasn't ready to be found," he said gently. "If you'd found me 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to accept help. I was too angry, too broken, too convinced that I deserved whatever punishment the world wanted to hand out. I had to get to this point rock bottom, broke, desperate before I could even consider letting someone help me climb back up." Maria looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her manicured nails and his permanently stained knuckles. "And now?" "Now I have a son who deserves better than what I've been able to give him," David said. "Now I'm tired enough to stop letting pride make decisions that hurt the people I love." "Including yourself?" David's smile was small but real. "We'll see. That one's harder." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of 5 years' worth of unfinished business settling between them like sediment in still water. Outside the break room, the sounds of the auto shop continued, tools clanging, engines running, the normal rhythm of work being done by people who understood that some things were worth fixing. "I should get back," David said finally, glancing at the clock on the wall. "Murphy's been good to me, but I can't take too long on breaks." Maria nodded and started to stand, then paused. "David, would it be okay if I came back? Maybe brought Emma to meet Jake properly? Sarah mentioned he doesn't get to be around other kids much." David's face brightened in a way that made him look years younger. "He'd love that. He's been talking about Emma since yesterday, about the girl who gave him hugs and made the crying stop." "Emma's good at that," Maria said. "She's good at seeing what people need and just providing it." "Wonder where she gets that from," David said. And there was something in his voice that made Maria's chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with guilt or grief. As they walked back through the shop, Maria felt something shifting in her chest. Some fundamental rearrangement of the pieces that had been scattered for 5 years. Not healing that would take time, work, conversations that went deeper than coffee in a break room, but recognition, the acknowledgement that they were both carrying pieces of each other's pain, and maybe, just maybe, They could help each other set those burdens down. David returned to his work on the Chevy, and Maria walked back to her car with his phone number saved in her contacts and a tentative plan to meet at the park on Saturday. It wasn't redemption, wasn't forgiveness, wasn't any of the grand gestures she'd imagined during her midnight searches. It was simpler than that, and more complicated. It was two broken people deciding to stop carrying their burdens alone. The park on Saturday morning was the kind of place where ordinary magic happened. Children discovering that swings could make them fly, parents finding moments of peace on benches worn smooth by years of worried hands, the simple alchemy of sunlight and laughter transforming anxiety into something manageable. Maria arrived 15 minutes early, Emma bouncing beside her with the contained energy of someone who'd been planning this moment for days. They'd brought supplies like they were staging a small invasion. Sandwiches cut into precise triangles, juice boxes that Emma had organized by flavor, a blanket that had seen duty everywhere from beach picnics to backyard camping adventures. Emma had also insisted on bringing her collection of sidewalk chalk, convinced that artistic collaboration was the foundation of all meaningful friendship. "There they are," Emma announced, pointing toward the parking lot where David was lifting Jake out of a car seat with the careful efficiency of someone who'd performed this operation thousands of times. Even from a distance, Maria could see the way David's movements were economical, practiced, tinged with the particular vigilance of a single parent who couldn't afford to let his guard down. Jake spotted Emma first and let out a delighted squeal that carried across the playground like a battle cry. He started running toward them with the unsteady enthusiasm of a 2-year-old who'd just discovered that legs were for more than walking, his curly hair bouncing with each step. David followed at a more measured pace, but Maria caught the smile that flickered across his face, the first genuinely relaxed expression she'd seen from him since their reunion. "Emma," Jake called out, though it came out more like Emma, and launched himself at her with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that hugs were always welcome. Emma caught him in an embrace that was equal parts gentle and fierce, her 8-year-old instincts perfectly calibrated to the needs of someone smaller and more fragile than herself. "Hi, Jake, I brought chalk. We're going to make the most beautiful pictures." David reached them as the children were already deep in negotiations about color selection and artistic vision. He looked better than he had at the auto shop cleaner, less exhausted, wearing jeans that actually fit and a shirt that wasn't stained with motor oil. But Maria could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the park for potential threats, the careful way he positioned himself so he could see all the exits. "This is nice," he said, settling onto the blanket beside her. "Jake's been talking about Emma all week. I think he's got his first crush." Maria laughed, watching as Emma patiently showed Jake how to grip a piece of blue chalk. "She's been the same way. Drew about 12 pictures of you and Jake, planned activities for the next 6 months. She's thorough when she decides she likes someone." "Smart kid," David said, and there was something in his voice that made Maria glance at him sideways. "She gets that from you." The comment settled between them like a question neither of them was quite ready to ask. There had been something building in their conversations over the past week, phone calls that started about practical matters and drifted into territory that felt dangerously close to flirtation, text messages that said more than they meant to. But the space between friendship and something else was fraught with complications that went beyond normal dating awkwardness. They were both carrying too much history, too much damage, too much responsibility to risk anything that might explode in their faces. But sitting here in the sunlight, watching their children create masterpieces with 99-cent chalk, Maria felt something loosening in her chest that had been wound tight for years. "I brought the VA paperwork," she said, pulling a folder from her bag. "If you want to go through it. I know a lawyer who specializes in disability appeals, and she thinks your case has merit." David's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Maria, I told you." "I know what you told me," she interrupted gently. "And I also know that Jake deserves to have his father's benefits reflect what actually happened to you over there. This isn't charity, David. This is getting you what you've earned." He was quiet for a moment, watching Jake attempt to draw what appeared to be either a dinosaur or a truck. "I've been turned down 3 times already. 3 different appeals. 3 different ways of telling me that my injuries aren't significant enough, or service-connected enough, or documented enough." "Because you were fighting alone," Maria said. "Because you didn't have someone who knew how to navigate the system, how to present evidence, how to make the case that what happened to you was the direct result of your service and your sacrifice." David looked at her, really looked, and she saw something shift in his expression. Not surrender exactly, but the recognition that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry every burden by himself. "What would it involve?" he asked. Maria opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper covered in her neat handwriting. "First, we request your complete medical records from Walter Reed in Germany. Then we get statements from everyone who was there that day, Rodriguez, Thompson, anyone who witnessed what happened. We document every symptom, every limitation, every way your injuries have affected your ability to work and function." "That's a lot of people to track down." "I've already started," Maria admitted. "Rodriguez is at Fort Bragg now. Thompson got out, but he's in Virginia. They both remember what happened, and they both want to help." David stared at the paper like it was written in a foreign language. "You did this without asking me?" For a moment, Maria worried she'd overstepped, that her eagerness to help had crossed some line into interference. But then she saw the expression on David's face, not anger, but something closer to amazement. "I made some phone calls," she said carefully. "I didn't commit you to anything, but I wanted to know what was possible before I brought it up." "Why?" The question was quiet, vulnerable, the same one he'd asked her in the break room, but weighted with different implications now. Maria watched Emma guide Jake's hand as he attempted to color inside the lines of a chalk flower. Her daughter's patience was infinite when it came to helping someone smaller than herself, her instinct to nurture running so deep it seemed cellular. "Because someone should have been fighting for you all along," she said finally. "Because you've been carrying this alone for too long, and you don't have to anymore." David was quiet for a long moment, studying the paperwork with the focused attention of someone trying to read his own future in bureaucratic language. "If we do this," he said slowly, "if we actually try to appeal again, and it doesn't work, then we'll have tried everything," Maria finished. "And we'll figure out what comes next. Together." The word hung in the air between them, carrying more weight than it should have. Together. It implied a future that extended beyond fixing VA paperwork, beyond playdates and phone calls, and the careful reconstruction of a friendship that had been interrupted by war and distance and the particular cruelty of systems that failed the people they were meant to serve. "Okay," David said, and it came out like a prayer. "Okay, let's try." The process of building a case against the VA turned out to be like conducting an archaeological dig through 5 years of buried trauma. Every document they requested came with its own small revelation, its own reminder of how close David had come to not making it home at all. The medical records from Germany were particularly brutal, page after page of surgical notes, traumatic brain injury assessments, descriptions of injuries that made Maria's hands shake when she read them alone in her kitchen at midnight. But there were victories too. Rodriguez, now a staff sergeant at Fort Bragg, spent an hour on the phone describing exactly what he'd witnessed that day in Kandahar. His voice thick with emotion as he recounted how David had thrown himself between Maria and the explosion without hesitation. Thompson, who'd left the army and was working as a contractor in Norfolk, wrote a detailed statement about David's condition in the weeks following the blast, about the seizures and memory problems and chronic pain that the official reports had somehow minimized. Maria found herself becoming an expert in VA regulations, learning the language of disability ratings and service connection determinations with the focused intensity she'd once applied to intelligence analysis. She made spreadsheets and timelines, organized evidence into categories that would make sense to bureaucrats who'd never heard incoming fire or felt the ground shake from an IED blast. David, meanwhile, was learning to let someone else carry part of his burden. It didn't come naturally. 5 years of single parenthood had taught him to be self-sufficient to the point of isolation, but Maria's persistent competence was hard to argue with. She showed up when she said she would, did what she promised to do, and never made him feel like accepting help was a failure of character. Their children became the bridge that made everything else possible. Emma and Jake were inseparable whenever they were together, their friendship uncomplicated by the careful negotiations that marked every interaction between their parents. Jake would reach for Emma's hand when they crossed the street, and Emma would automatically slow her pace to match his shorter legs. They communicated in the wordless way of children who'd decided they belonged together, creating games that made sense only to them and laughing at jokes that adults couldn't understand. "They're good for each other," David observed one evening as they watched the kids build an elaborate fort out of couch cushions and blankets. They were at Maria's apartment the first time David had been inside her space, and she'd been nervous about what he'd think of the careful order she maintained, the way everything had a place and a purpose. "Emma's never had a little brother," Maria said, handing him a beer that he accepted with the careful gratitude of someone still learning how to receive kindness. "She's always been the only child, the one all the adult attention focuses on. It's good for her to be the big sister for once." "And Jake's never had anyone treat him like he's completely normal," David replied. "Like his dad's struggles don't make him different or damaged or something to be pitied." The observation hit harder than Maria expected. She'd been so focused on David's needs, on the practical matters of appeals and paperwork and navigating systems, that she hadn't fully considered how single parenthood had affected Jake. But watching him now, seeing how he bloomed under Emma's attention, she began to understand that the healing they were all doing was more complex than she'd realized. "Are we doing the right thing?" she asked quietly. "Getting the kids this attached to each other, I mean, what if?" "What if what?" David asked, though his voice suggested he'd been thinking about the same possibilities. "What if the appeal doesn't work? What if you decide you don't want us in your life anymore? What if I get deployed again?" The questions had been circling in her head for weeks, growing louder as she watched Emma and Jake become more inseparable. Children formed attachments quickly, completely, without the careful hedging that adults use to protect themselves from disappointment. If this arrangement fell apart, Emma and Jake would be the casualties. David was quiet for a moment, watching Jake show Emma how to make the blanket fort more structurally sound. "Do you want to get deployed again?" The question caught her off guard. What do you mean?" "I mean you've built your entire career around being willing to go anywhere, do anything, take any assignment no matter how dangerous or remote. But now you have roots here. Emma has friends, you have." He gestured between them, encompassing whatever this was becoming. "Do you still want to run toward danger, or have you found something worth staying for?" Maria felt something click into place in her chest, like a puzzle piece she'd been carrying for years, finally finding its proper position. The restless energy that had driven her through 3 deployments, the constant need to prove herself worthy of survival, the way she'd thrown herself at every dangerous assignment like penance all of it, had been about running away from the guilt of coming home when David hadn't. But David was home now. Broken, struggling, but home. And for the first time since that day in Kandahar, Maria felt like she could breathe without permission. "I want to stay," she said, and heard the surprise in her own voice. "I want to build something here that's worth protecting instead of constantly trying to prove I deserve what I already have." David's smile was slow but genuine. "Good," he said, "because Jake would be devastated if Emma disappeared, and honestly, so would I." The admission hung between them like a bridge. Neither of them was quite ready to cross, but its presence changed the landscape of every conversation that followed. They began spending more time together, not just for the children, but because they'd remembered how much they'd once enjoyed each other's company. David would come over after work and help Emma with her math homework while Maria made dinner. Maria would stop by the auto shop with Jake when she picked him up from daycare, letting him help David with simple tasks that made him feel important and useful. Slowly, carefully, they began to remember how to be friends, and just as slowly, just as carefully, they began to discover what they might become if they were brave enough to try. The PTSD episode hit on a Thursday night in March, 6 weeks after David's appeal had been approved and he'd received his first disability payment that actually reflected the extent of his injuries. Maria had started to think the worst was behind them, that the combination of financial stability and emotional support had given David enough solid ground to stand on. She should have known better. Emma was spending the night at a friend's house, and Maria had come over to David's apartment with takeout and homework to grade. It was becoming a comfortable routine of quiet evenings where they could talk without small ears listening, where David could decompress from work and Maria could pretend that domestic tranquility was something she deserved. Jake had gone to bed early, exhausted from a day at daycare, and they were settling in to watch a movie when the storm rolled in. Spring storms in North Carolina could be violent, arriving with little warning and shaking houses with thunder that sounded too much like artillery fire. The first crack of lightning made David flinch, but Maria thought nothing of it. Loud noises had been bothering him since she'd known him, a common enough symptom of traumatic brain injury that she'd learned to work around. But as the storm intensified, as the thunder became more frequent and more violent, she watched David's breathing change, watched his hands start to shake, watched him disappear into a place she couldn't follow. "David?" she said quietly, but he didn't respond. His eyes were open but unfocused, his body rigid with tension that had nothing to do with the weather outside and everything to do with a marketplace in Kandahar where explosions had taught him that loud noises meant death was coming. Maria had been trained in crisis intervention, had talked other soldiers through panic attacks and flashbacks, but this was different. This was David, and watching him fight battles she couldn't see felt like drowning in air. She moved slowly, carefully, keeping her voice low and steady. "David, you're home. You're in your apartment in North Carolina. Jake is sleeping in his room. You're safe." But the words weren't reaching him. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and she could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the coolness of the room. He was somewhere else entirely, trapped in a moment that had ended 5 years ago but lived on in the neural pathways that trauma had carved into his brain. Another crack of thunder shook the building, and David doubled over like he'd been hit. Maria made a decision that went against every rule of crisis intervention she'd ever learned. She reached out and took his hand, anchoring him to the present with the simple reality of human touch. "I'm here," she said firmly. "You're not alone this time. I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." Slowly, gradually, she felt the tension in his hand begin to ease. His breathing started to deepen, and his eyes began to focus on her face instead of whatever horrors he'd been seeing. The storm outside was beginning to move off, the thunder becoming more distant, but Maria kept talking, kept holding his hand, kept reminding him that the war was over and he'd made it home. "Maria?" His voice was rough, uncertain, like someone waking up from a nightmare. "I'm here," she repeated. "You're okay. You're home." David looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, taking inventory of familiar objects and safe spaces. Then he looked back at her, and she saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before. Not just gratitude, but recognition. The understanding that she'd seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't flinched, hadn't judged, hadn't run. "I'm sorry," he said, though she couldn't imagine what he thought he had to apologize for. "Don't," she said firmly. "Don't apologize for having PTSD. Don't apologize for being human. Don't apologize for surviving something that would have broken most people." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm move away and the normal sounds of the apartment building settling around them. David's hand was still in hers, and she realized she didn't want to let go. Not because he needed her to hold on, but because she needed to hold on to him. "The first time this happened," David said quietly, "Sarah called 911. The paramedics came, and Jake woke up crying, and the whole thing it was a disaster. She never knew what to do with it, how to help me through it." "Sarah wasn't a soldier," Maria said gently. "She didn't have training in combat stress reactions." "No, but she had something you don't," David replied, and Maria felt her chest tighten with the familiar weight of inadequacy. "What's that?" "She had the right to be here," he said, then quickly shook his head. "That came out wrong. I know what you meant," Maria interrupted, but there was no hurt in her voice. You meant she didn't have to earn her place in your life. She was your wife, the mother of your child. She belonged here by right, not by whatever this is." David turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "What this is," he said carefully, "is the most important relationship in my life outside of Jake. What this is someone who understands what I've been through because she was there. What this is someone who sees me as more than my damage." The words settled between them like a foundation being poured, solid and permanent, and strong enough to build on. Maria felt something she'd been holding back for months maybe, years finally break free in her chest. "I love you," she said, and immediately felt terrified at how easily the words had come. "I don't know when it happened, or how, or if it's appropriate given everything we've been through together, but I love you. Not because of guilt or obligation or shared trauma, but because you're good and kind and brave, and because watching you love Jake has reminded me what courage actually looks like." David's smile was slow and bright and completely transformative. "I love you too," he said. "I've been trying not to, because it felt too complicated, too risky, too much like asking for more happiness than I deserved. But Emma loves Jake like he's her own brother, and Jake lights up whenever you walk into a room, and I can't imagine a life without you in it anymore." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, weighted with all the careful hope they'd been building over months of shared dinners and coordinated childcare and bureaucratic battles fought side by side. It tasted like coming home after a long deployment, like safety earned through survival, like the possibility that two broken people might actually be able to build something whole together. 6 months later, Maria stood in the backyard of a house they'd bought together, a small place with good schools and a fenced yard where Jake could run safely and Emma could practice soccer without worrying about hitting cars. The VA appeal had been successful enough to provide David with steady disability payments and health care that actually covered his needs. Maria had turned down a deployment to South Korea, choosing instead to accept a position at the local recruiting station that would keep her close to home. They weren't married, that conversation was still in the future, wrapped up in practical considerations about custody arrangements and military benefits, and the simple question of whether two people who'd learned to survive alone could learn to thrive together. But they were building something that felt permanent, something that could withstand storms and setbacks and the inevitable challenges that came with blending two damaged lives into something resembling a family. Emma and Jake were in the sandbox David had built in the corner of the yard, engaged in an elaborate construction project that involved buckets and shovels and a level of architectural ambition that was probably doomed to failure. But they were laughing, covered in sand and completely absorbed in their work, and watching them felt like witnessing a small miracle. "Think it'll hold?" David asked, settling beside her on the back steps with 2 cups of coffee and the easy familiarity of someone who belonged in her space. "The sandcastle? Probably not." "I meant us," he said quietly. "This whole crazy experiment we're trying." Maria looked at him, really looked, and saw not the broken soldier she'd found in a grocery store checkout line, but the man who'd learned to build a life from the scattered pieces of survival. His scars were still there, visible and permanent, but they'd become part of a larger story that included healing and hope and the radical act of choosing love over fear. "Yeah," she said, leaning against his shoulder and feeling the solid warmth of him anchor her to this moment, this place, this imperfect but beautiful life they were creating together. "I think it'll hold." In the sandbox, Emma was showing Jake how to pack sand more tightly, her 8-year-old wisdom applied to the serious business of structural engineering. Jake listened with the focused attention of someone learning from a master, and when their castle inevitably collapsed, they laughed and started building again. Maria watched them play and felt something she'd never expected to feel again: peace. Not the temporary quiet that came between storms, but the deep, lasting peace that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged, with exactly the people you were meant to protect. The war was over. They'd all made it home. And for the first time in 5 years, that felt like enough.